After the underwhelming release of GameCube, it seemed that Nintendo's console career would end faster than Sega's after the Dreamcast. But the story took a different turn. The company suddenly changed its strategy, leaving the 7th generation console competition and simultaneously drawing a lot of attention. Obviously, we're talking about Nintendo Wii, which turned out to be an innovative, family and budget-friendly console. Today, I invite you to remember how a small console with a remote instead of joystick sold better than the PS3 and Xbox 360.
Third dimension with its own brain.
Nintendo has always been known for its love of finding new ways to play video games. Whether it is the ancient Virtual Boy, which tried its best to be a VR headset, or the modern Nintendo Labo, which turns cardboard into costly controllers. So, after the GameCube, the company went back to that shtick. In the very first presentation of Wii, which back then was called Revolution, Nintendo put forward a new way of interacting with the player and said that power isn't what makes a good console. And right they were, because Wii's hardware wasn't exactly the best when compared to its 7th generation counterparts. The new way of interaction was, of course, the new controller, Wii Remote or Wiimote for short. At first glance, it differed from the controllers we were used to, resembling something between a TV remote and a landline telephone. But upon a closer inspection, it turned out to be an excellent motion controller equipped with accelerometer, speaker, vibration feedback, and even gyroscope in later versions. Some games required a second controller with a funny name, Nunchuk, which could be wired to the main one. The resulting construction allowed very precise motion capture, making the playing process more than comfortable. By the way, fun fact, they first started making Wiimote back for the GameCube. A prototype even popped up at the auction in 2018. However, given the history of both consoles, it's good that the project was delayed. The Wii inherited a whole library of video games from its predecessors. However, this applies only to the first version of the console. It certainly is a damn shame that the new models were deprived of this feature, but even without it, there was still much to play. Unlike the PS3 and Xbox 360, which often shared games with one another, the Wii, largely because of its peculiar controller, locked itself within exclusives on one hand, as each port required a complete rework of the controls, and stood out for its unique project on the other. The multi-platform titles that managed to survive the porting often had unique features that increased interest to the Wii version. And since the development process of our today's console went smoothly and quietly, I suggest we move on to the games. Let's start with the new Mario, shall we? It's Nintendo after all. Now, of course, more than one part of the series was released on Wii, but I'll focus on Super Mario Galaxy. The synopsis of this 3D platformer was as follows. Bowser once again kidnapped Princess Peach. While to stop him, our beloved plumber finds himself on a remote planet from where he starts his journey through other galaxies. However, those were no ordinary worlds with weird flora and fauna. The player could be sent on a tiny ball with gravity, which he could easily run around the Ecuador on a cube with question panels instead of faces, and all of it was held together around a black hole with the passage from very first Mario in the background. The player could even end up on a giant stonefish, swimming in the ocean of space. As for the gameplay, the developers did what they do best. They took a well-tried formula, brought it up to perfection. As in Mario 64, the player had to gather stars in various quests in order to reach the end of the story. To this end, the developers made a whole arsenal of abilities, which included classics like jumping in every direction, swimming, ground pound, and as well some new tricks like the ability to spin around to stun the enemies. The player could also get additional gameplay options by picking up character power-ups. For example, the game had the Fire Mario suit from the first games in the series, which allowed Mario to throw small fireballs. As you would expect, the whole thing was controlled with the Wiimote, with all its features. For example, you had to shake the joystick to spin and drag the virtual crosshair manually to collect the scattered star bits. Such controls seemed odd at first, but the first hour of the game showed that everything was convenient and responsive. The rest hardly needs any commentary. The graphics, the levels, and especially the soundtrack were done at the highest level. Even if you, like myself, are not a die-hard fan of Mario Adventures, I would still recommend Galaxy as an extremely high-quality 3D platformer. Speaking of Mario, it would be a crime not to mention the exclusive Mario Kart Wii of the Mario Kart series. The essence of the game is known for anyone who at least once has played any racing game with karts, which are small, flat racing cars. We were given a set of cartoonish characters from both Mario and Donkey Kong universe, a set of themed tracks, and a number of power-ups to boost yourself and throwables to attack other races. That's it. Push the pedal to the metal. However, despite the rather hackneyed gameplay formula, the Wii part was quite fun to play, especially in multiplayer. To control the character, the player had to use the same Wiimote, only instead of holding it like a remote, he had to dual wield it like an 8-bit console joystick. The interesting thing about Mario Kart was the steering wheel that it came with. In a nutshell, it was just a piece of plastic with a place to put the Wiimote in. It didn't exactly help the steering, but the illusion of a wireless floating steering wheel was amusing at the very least. As for the innovations, the game all of a sudden offered you to drive motorcycles, which were slightly different in characteristics. Also, the characters roster had been expanded, plus the game got the online service support for the console, so you could compete online, at least until the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection service was shut down in 2014. All in all, it's certainly not Need for Speed or Forza, but still enough to have some fun with your friends. Mario is great and all, but surprisingly, the biggest hit of the Wii wasn't Mario, nor even Zelda, which I'll get to in a bit. It was Wii Sports, which came with the console. It was a collection of sports simulators that included tennis, baseball, golf, bowling, and boxing. It seemed to be nothing special. We've seen such games even back in the 8-bit era, but here it was all about the controls that changed everything. For example, in tennis the player had to swing the remote like a racket, while the console processed the force in the direction of the swing. In bowling, the player had to imitate the throw of a ball, and in boxing the game asked you to take the joystick in your hand and start smashing virtual faces. There were also a few other goodies, like the simple rating system that showed the player's skill in various sports, and the support for console avatars called Me. Despite the fact that it was far from a Bioshock level masterpiece, Wii Sports was a great success, as evidenced by its enormous sales. The novelty of the controls and the fact that the game came bundled with the console played a big part in this. But the success was mostly due to the game's focus on an extremely wide audience. Simplistic sports simulators that need you to swing the joystick in front of the screen could easily amuse children, were accessible and understandable for the older audience, and didn't irritate even the hardened gamers like you and me. Actually, we became quite popular with fitness sports, etc., which resulted in not only various titles, but also unusual accessories. The console got a whole bunch of different joystick attachments that imitated clubs, rackets, pistols, fishing rods, and whatever you can think of. Here we should also mention the classic controller, intended for those who weren't interested in all the motion games but wanted decent controls. The pinnacle of sports and recreational thinking, however, was the Wii Balance Board, a small board that had several weights to determine the player's center of gravity. One may ask, and why in the world would a console need that? So I'll give an example. Just like Wii Sports allowed us to box using our hands, so did this thing, which allowed us to say ski by leaning left or right. You could do that with Wii Fit, one of the few titles that supported the balance board. In a nutshell, it was also a collection of athletic disciplines, only a bit more workout oriented. There were 4 categories: yoga, strength training, aerobics, and balance games. And in each one you could find a whole bunch of exercises, ranging from snowboard balancing to the downward facing dog pose. I kid you not, Google it if you don't believe me. All jokes aside, Wii Fit was a really fun thing to keep yourself in shape. For those who like running without leaving the sofa, our today's console had exclusive Sonic games. Back in the day, just the existence of such games caused quite a hoo-ha. To think, Sonic himself and exclusively for Nintendo. However, in the future the Hedgehog will have to deal with worse things. If you don't mind, I'll skip the secret rings, which took us on a journey through the world of 1001 Nights with some really inconvenient controls, and the Black Knight, which all of a sudden armed the series characters with swords and armor. Instead, I'll tell you about Sonic Colors, which wasn't a weirdish spin-off, but a rightful part of the main storyline. In it, Dr. Eggman created a huge interstellar amusement park, and not just another Disneyland, but a whole system of united planets. Of course, nobody asked the inhabitants of these planets, the multicolored wisps, who possess great energy. Sonic, like any normal hero, wasn't happy about all this and set off on a speedy journey to the Doctor's base. The gameplay, in its core, hasn't changed since the past parts of the series. You run, jump, attack enemies, and use boost. Wisps were this part's shtick. They granted Sonic various extra abilities like digging through the ground, flying, sticking to walls, and so on. The idea proved to be so cool that wisps can be found in almost every game of the franchise starting from Colors, although it hardly adds up with the storyline. All in all, the levels were somewhat too straight and the plot wasn't that fascinating, but otherwise, Colors was a great game about Sonic's adventures, worth of getting yourself a Wii, if not for the recent remaster for all the platforms. So I suggest taking a closer look at it. However, Wii's game library didn't consist solely of family-friendly stuff. Fans of harsh and brutal games were in for a treat as well. Take Red Steel 2, for example, a first-person shooter where you can both shoot and use your katana. The first installment was solid, but rather boring, while the totally unrelated second one fascinated with its strange mixture of a Western and a Japanese action movie. This alone was enough to spark interest because an Asian sheriff coming out of a saloon only to disappear in a grove of sakuras was rather unusual. We won't be speculating on what substances were used by the developers. Instead, let's say a couple words about the combat system, which was exceptionally good. Decent cowboy gunfights were one thing, but close combat was just pure fencing madness. Of course, you had to work both with virtual hands and your own. The game was great at reading your movements. You could perform various lunges, parries, and charge attacks if you swing really hard. The main task was not to smash the TV in the process. Also, Red Steel 2 had some nice cell shading, which we always can't get enough of. The game to one-up Red Steel 2 in brutality was Mad World. This hack and slash is so bloody and gory that visually there are literally three colors: white, black, and red. The gameplay was designed to match that, and we were playing as an ex-military, now mercenary, who will use literally anything he can find to slaughter his enemies. Barrels, road signs, various transport, and of course the main weapon, Chainsaw Glove. As you've probably guessed, the controls also required you to move around in front of the screen. But when the game asks you not to kick a ball, but to spin an enemy and throw him in a garbage container, that's a whole different experience. There was also a story somewhere in there. A small town gets cut off from the world, the virus has been spread into the air, whoever kills the most people will get a vaccine. To hell with it. I'd rather launch another dummy into a burning tank in all this black and white and red trash. It's easy to forget that we're still talking about Nintendo console. Perhaps if Mad World had a slightly more varied gameplay that didn't get boring after a couple of hours, it would share the same stage with Carmageddon that had similar features for light-headed fun. So far, we've talked about family-friendly titles as well as the brutal ones, which means that right now, it's time for something epic. To my mind, the best Wii game of this kind was an RPG called Xenoblade Chronicles. It immersed us in the story of a very unusual world that consists of an endless ocean and the bodies of two titans who died fighting each other. On these bodies appeared organic and mechanical life forms, which of course also started fighting each other, couldn't have been otherwise. The game's protagonist, named Shulk, was lucky to find an extremely powerful energy sword, and here started the huge adventure that could easily drag you in for tens of hours. Design-wise, Xenoblade resembled an MMORPG, huge locations, unique art style, epic story, and much more that made it clear that we were dealing with a huge work of art, not a small indie game. It was even surprising how all this beauty ran on relatively weak Wii. Xenoblade Chronicles also recently got a remaster that improved gameplay and graphics, so now you can partake this legendary RPG with a design even better than the original. And since I started this video with Mario, it will only be fair to wrap it up with Zelda. Apart from the Twilight Princess port from GameCube, which was quite good and worth players' attention, the Wii received an exclusive called Skyward Sword. On the exterior, it was a classic Zelda with exploration, puzzles and enemies, except that the interchange between dungeons and the open world has been reworked, and now most of the world was like one huge dungeon. The story was another equally classic prequel that provided some more answers to the question, what has brought us to the previous games in the series? I know it's hard to believe, but the game's main feature was the controls. However, if before games would you just say, look, now you can wave your hands instead of pressing the buttons, Skyward Sword was able to make the Wiimote achieve its full potential. Every hand movement was tracked perfectly, which allowed to create enemies that required a precise attack to be defeated. Other items, like the slingshot, also actively used motion control, and I'm not talking about the virtual cross here, I'm talking about gyroscopes and accelerometers. To do this, the game required the Motion Plus extension, which at first had to be attached to the Wiimote, but later versions had it by default. By the way, the limited edition of Zelda had a golden joystick with the extension already built in. Actually, Skyward Sword was so confident with its feature that Link, debatably the most famous left-handed video game character, turned right-handed for this game for the sake of sword controls. That is, here we had a small revolution in motion controls. Basically, the Wii itself was a revolution, fully justifying its original name. Here, the already familiar games got a new perspective, which made even the usual virtual golf interesting and fun. Nintendo yet again showed us that they're not just filling the market, they're pushing the industry forward. And eventually, they left the 7th generation console competition for their own field, all while winning at least in sales. Yes, surprisingly the Wii, being less powerful and lacking the ability to port sensational blockbusters without shamanistic rituals, sold 101 million consoles, leaving the PS3 and Xbox 360 behind with 87 and 84 million respectively. Of course, there's a lot of nuances, as we have to take into account the success of games on the console, its lower price, but in my opinion, it's still a worthy reason to be proud. And on this cheerful note, I invite you to the comments. Tell us how you were going wild with the Wiimote in front of your TV. And of course, leave a like and subscribe for more nostalgic content. Next, we'll be talking about the generation's remaining titan, Sony and the PS3, so don't miss it and stay tuned.